Good morning. On behalf of the Encounter, I want to welcome everybody, those here at the Metropolitan Pavilion and those following us online. My name is Greg Wolfe. I'm the publisher and editor of Slant Books, and I will be moderating this event. It's an honor and a privilege to be joined today by two of America's leading writers, and I'll give you their short bios. Chris Beha is the author of the memoir, The Whole 5 Feet, and the novels Arts and Entertainment and What Happened to Sophie Wilder. His most recent novel, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, was nominated for the 2020 National Book Award. He serves as editor of Harper's magazine. Ron Hansen is the author of 10 novels, including Mariette in Ecstasy, Atticus, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford, Exiles, and Hitler's Niece. He's also the author of 2 collections of stories and 2 books of essays. He is Gerard Manley Hopkins, S.J., Professor Emeritus in the Arts and Humanities at Santa Clara University in Northern California. He is an ordained deacon and is married to the novelist Bo Caldwell. And I should say that we have a fairly amazing fact to share with you, and that is that both speakers are identical twins. I mean, not to each other, to their siblings, and respectively. I want to say I'm really happy to be talking about fiction today, because in the history of this event, we've talked a lot about poetry. And, you know, it's easy to wax poetic about poetry. But fiction is a sister art form, and I would argue of equal dignity. It does get a little bit down and dirty at times, that's true, and of course, this is where the obligatory Flannery O'Connor quote comes in, right? Fiction, she says, fiction is about everything human. And we are made of dust. And if you scorn getting yourself dusty, then you shouldn't try to write fiction. It's not grand enough for you. So let's talk about getting down and dusty today, what writing fiction means, and what value it has for ourselves, for our own personal journeys, as well as the larger culture. As our title for this session indicates, our topic this morning is going to center around the question of yearning or desire. But before we get there, I'd like to start with a couple of very basic, fundamental questions. I've been reading a wonderful group biography of 4 women philosophers, Metaphysical Animals. It's a wonderful book about 4 20th century philosophers, and in that book there's this allusion to a BBC series that aired after World War II, and basically the series was, what is the point of? And what is the point of philosophy? What is the point of etc. So I'd like to start here with a very similar approach. Like, what is the point of fiction? Like, why make stuff up? We may be in the 21st century, but there are still people today who say, you know, life is hard enough. Shouldn't we stick to the facts? Shouldn't we stick to, you know, what's going on in front of us? Why make these things up? So I'm going to just lob this in the direction of whoever wants to start. Why do this thing? Why make up stories?
Well, it's been proven that it increases empathy for other people, that in inhabiting somebody else's life or lives within a book, you get to learn how other people think and feel. And I think that's part of it. I think part of my instinct in writing is to want to understand something about somebody I've read about or stories I've heard about.
I want to start with a kind of meta remark on the what is the point questions. there's a sort of truism that has been expressed by a number of famous thinkers in different ways, to the effect that it is only when a particular cultural practice or set of norms or even civilization itself comes into doubt or gets challenged from the outside or starts to come into contact with other civilizations or cultural practices, that those who practice it in a kind of naive, shall we say, way, in Schiller's sense, start to theorize and philosophize about that practice. And it is very often at that moment when your set of values get brought into question that you start to tell stories about how they came into being, for example. It is then that you start to have these origin myths, whereas you didn't have to answer the question before, where did our values come from? They are our values. So I would say, I, as a writer, do not spend a lot of time asking myself, why do I write? And I think that any writer who does is probably in some trouble. Just as if you find yourself every morning looking across the breakfast table and saying, why am I married to this person? That's not a great sign for the marriage. That even if you are answering it in really affirmative ways, the most affirmative way to answer is to stop asking the question. So I value having the opportunity to come to settings like this, get asked questions like this, and work through the answers. But I think it's worth emphasizing the fact that on a day-to-day basis, I think most writers are not asking themselves the question. At a certain point, you come to understand in a very intuitive way, I think, that this is your way of being in the world, and then you go about doing it. That said, the particular project that Ron and I are engaged in, which is more or less realist literary fiction, unquestionably has come into, its own practitioners have come to doubt it these days. So we have things like autofiction, where novelists take as their subject this question that you've raised of why do we make things up? And I have some, I could go on a long time about the significance of that cultural change, but to go back to my initial point, I think we tell stories in order to understand our own values and sets of norms, as I said, and it becomes particularly valuable to tell those stories when those norms are under attack from either the inside or the outside.
Right. Well, why don't we take the same question, maybe just from a more personal, biographical point of view, like how did you come to be a writer of fiction? I mean, was it just, again, an unself-conscious process? I mean, at some point, there's this level of kind of curiosity about the gift that you've been given, and others around you might question it or, ask you to clarify what you're thinking in terms of pursuing this life.
I remember when I was in grade school, we were assigned an essay, and my hand went up and I said, could I write a short story instead? And I don't know where that came from. And I noticed that nobody else in the classroom wanted to do that. They went ahead to do the essay. And I think for me, it was, I felt there were some questions I knew the answer to, and some questions I wanted to understand by writing fiction. And it was understanding a bit about yourself, but also about other people.
I would bring in, for me, I don't again think about it in these terms often, but since you've raised the point that we're both identical twins, I would say that one thing that happens if you grow up with an identical twin is that you one, I find that from a very young age, you have an experience that a lot of people don't have until they grow up and maybe have children, or but a sense that there is someone else in your life whose happiness and well-being is more important to you than your own. And that can be in a very emotionally formative experience. But there's also, you grow up with a kind of shadow life, right? There is someone who looks like you, who is genetically like you, who's growing up in the same environment, who nonetheless is making different choices than you are. And those choices are taking him or her off in a different direction than you're going in. And so I naturally found myself thinking in terms of counterfactuals and hypotheticals and things like that. Naturally found myself thinking through what it would be for my life to be some other life. Also, what it was about me that made me essentially me and not the person next to me who people from the outside were constantly mixing me up with, you know. I think, we'll talk more about fiction, prose fiction versus poetry, and other forms. But one of the things that I think the novel does very well is balance the exterior and the interior life. Lyric poetry is often an expression of a kind of conscious moment. And then the plastic arts are depictions of external reality. And fiction to me is something that attempts to do both. It attempts to show the external facts about the world and the internal facts of a particular consciousness working through those things. If you're a twin, you have someone who shares so many of your external facts, who you know very intimately, who you also know is not you. You also know does not share a certain set of internal facts. And in fact, one of the questions that an identical twin growing up will get really sincerely asked all the time is whether the two of you can read each other's minds. Did you get asked this question? I got asked this question many times. I mean, usually by peers, so it's like you're in 5th grade and some other, 12-year-old is asking that question. But, to a surprisingly late age, you're still getting asked that question, not as a joke. And it suggests to me something actually quite profound, which has to do with people's inability to separate out the external facts from the internal facts. To see that these two people are not distinguishable by me on the basis of appearance, which means that they must be indistinguishable in reality. So those kinds of questions were always very urgent to me. And then the question that comes out of that is, well, presumably my brother was faced with similar things, and he became a securities litigator. But that fact itself, that it wasn't, I responded to our twinness in a different way than he responded to our twinness, is part of, the larger set of facts that I was kind of dealing with.
Another thing about being a twin, and I'm asked this question all the time, is did you have a private language that we shared with each other? And I think the fact that we did have a private language, and it meant we invented these words and shared them with each other and understood them, and that feeds into being a fiction writer, I believe. Just the love of language itself, but also the sense of that there's a privacy to it and a way of sharing it.
Yeah. Chris, I like the way you talk about fiction as both trying to present us with sort of an exterior and an interior. There have been a lot of quotes and statements over the decades about, fiction helps. There's this fine line between trying to recreate the experience of everyday life, realism, and yet a certain amount of selection and organizing. In a sense, fiction, I would posit, tries to recreate experience, what it is to what it is to live, what it is to experience. But then there's this other dimension, and it's also very delicate, like both an experience but also a judgment. As you read, the author is hopefully not preaching to you, but giving you at least a framework in which to evaluate or judge the kind of quality of what's going on. Is that a tricky process to pull that off?
You answer.
Well, so I have a lot of complicated feelings on this subject. One of my favorite writers is George Eliot, and Eliot is an extremely didactic writer. She really does not mind both giving you a set of facts and telling you why she's showing them to you in this way and what it's supposed to mean. You know, but she's I think it was Harold Bloom who said that Eliot is the only novelist whose authorial intrusions improve the work. Almost everyone else, including someone like Tolstoy, when they step in and start to interpret their own work and philosophize, you wish they'd just go back to telling you the story. But Eliot is such an astute human psychologist and such an astute moral thinker that you love being in her presence. So if it can be done well, I think that sort of evaluation can be a wonderful thing. But I am also, one of my other real touchstones is Henry James. The famous line about James from Eliot, not from George Eliot, from T.S. Eliot, was that he had a mind so fine that no idea could penetrate it. There was the idea with he wanted to give you just the palpable reality, and he did not think it was his job to give you the interpretation, but he was just going to show you it exactly as it is. And I think there's something very powerful about that too. And I think we have a bit of our culture right now is very uncomfortable with art that does not tell you what you are supposed to think about it, that shows you humanity and does not also stand safely in judgment of that humanity. And in my own work, I'm much drawn to situations or characters where there is some ambivalence, where I myself don't know entirely what I think about it, where I can set as a project for myself just rendering the thing itself as clearly as possible, and I can leave to the reader making the judgments.
Yeah, I think we've lost the sense of ambiguity as a positive thing, as an openness to mystery, and as an act that, on the part of the author, gives space to the reader to participate in the process. That great art in any form, whether literary or other, is really about the way that the viewer or the receiver completes the work, right? It's not just something that, we live in the age of TV and YouTube, and we're used to things getting dumped on our lap, but ideally there should be a kind of interactivity in which we are participating and which not everything is given to us, right? I think of like Mariette in Ecstasy is a classic work of ambiguity, because you have this nun who experiences the stigmata. So the fundamental question is this real, or is she taking a nail to her hands and feet and so on? But even more so in the book, you play very well with this tradition, the sort of Song of Songs, the eros, the love of God that has a kind of erotic dimension, so there's the deeply spiritual, but also the fleshly. So you want to talk a little bit about ambiguity and why that's important?
Well, I was thinking about my own fiction, which I always do, of course. And I thought that if there's some consistency of all my subjects, is about outlaws or people in extremis. They're usually people with reckless ambition or pride or something that exaggerates qualities of myself, either good or bad. And sometimes it's the life unlived that I'm writing about, but you do the same thing. Yeah. There's always a quality of exploration and like putting yourself in a weird or unusual situation and seeing how you would react to that. I remember reading about a study they did of cats, and the cats had been indoors all their lives, and yet they discovered that when they dreamt, they were dreaming about chasing mice, getting their food. So it's almost like it was a computer program that was rehearsing things that might be necessary later. And in some ways, that's what fiction is for me, is anticipating something that could happen and seeing the right or wrong way of acting.
But you know, you both, I think, have somewhat distinct approaches to your subject matter. I mean, Ron, you really do seem to go pretty far afield, you know, Westerns, you know, kind
Hitler.
of 1920s, screwball comedy.
Right, yeah.
Chris, you stay fairly close to kind of a cultural milieu that is probably fairly similar to what you've experienced as...
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if that will remain true throughout the course of my career, but it has been true so far. The second, I wrote two sort of desk drawer novels that never got published. One I wrote as an undergraduate, and then the first one I wrote, you know, throughout my 20s, there was a serious kind of adult effort at fiction, was what I think now people would call a literary fantasy novel. But I wasn't reading fantasy. Well, I was reading John Crowley, but I was like reading Nabokov and people like that. And what I was really resistant to the autobiographical fiction that a lot of my peers were writing. Everybody who was, you know, I knew who was, you know, in the literary world in their 20s was writing about people in the literary world in their 20s in New York trying to write their first novels. And I didn't want to do that. So I wrote this novel where everything was made up. The days of the week were made up. The measurements were made up. When they spoke about how long something was in distance, they used made up units. And it took me, I spent 6 years on this novel, and it was a mess. And it went in a desk drawer. And then I wrote a novel about a young man working in the literary world in New York and writing his second novel, not writing his first, because I'd already written my first. And that became my first published novel. And I, you know, one of the things that I had to, I think, come to recognize was that the themes that I was interested in could be worked through in this form.
All right, let's move on to this core theme of our session today, was this question of yearning or desire. I mean, the classic writing workshop question that's always asked is, what does this character want, right? And do you feel like that's a legitimate question? I mean, is that, do you think about, again, or is this unconscious? Because clearly, you know, that is a driving factor, because these characters are going through some journey of some kind. So, want to jump in on that?
Well, I do agree that what a character wants is really crucial, and what a character is afraid of is also crucial. Within that is their passions, and like I never write about myself, but I write about glimpses of myself within the characters. And it's a way of identifying what's really important to me at the time, and trying to find some kind of resolution to those difficulties.
I think, you know, to return to the question of ambiguity or ambivalence, it's not always, we don't always have very clear wants, you know. Or we have wants within ourselves that conflict with other wants within ourselves. I think asking what a character wants is a fruitful thing to do, but I think that it can be a mistake to just sort of like answer it with just one thing. I think that's the sort of the way that a lot of formulaic fiction, particularly television and movie fiction, there's this idea that like the character has to want this one thing, it's got to be very clear, and we have to watch that character attempt to get that one thing, and in the end either get it or fail to get it.
The marriage plot.
Yeah, and I think one of the sources to me of our, or maybe it's just a different manifestation of our cultural discomfort with ambiguity, is a sense that every problem or question that can be properly posed should have a single clear answer. This is a sort of Wittgensteinian idea that you ought to be able to clearly articulate what all of the questions are, and part of what makes something a real question is it has a real answer, and that even if we don't know it, that answer is knowable, and it is knowable in sort of a clear way. So there's that. There's everything that can be broken into questions or problems with clear potential solutions, and then there is whereof we cannot speak, thereof we must remain silent. And that latter part is what fiction deals in, It poses questions that don't have clear answers, or it deals in ways of living that can't be sort of rationally managed, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that I'm very interested in is when a character behaves in ways that seem inconsistent with what that character is supposed to want. Or when a character believes him or herself to want one thing, but keeps... I'm really interested in characters who get in their own way. The last novel, as you know, is called The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, and I have said more than once that when I found out about this, which is a real baseball statistic made up by Bill James, and when I found this statistic, The Index of Self-Destructive Acts, I knew right away that I wanted to make that the title of a novel, because it seemed to me that almost every great novel could be called The Index of Self-Destructive Acts. That this is one of the perennial topics of great fiction, is the way that we sabotage ourselves, and part of that is by being by having crooked natures. That is the crooked timber of humanity, is we don't want the things that we feel we're supposed to want, or we know what we want, but then we have some sort of sub-yearning that causes us to behave in ways that's inconsistent with that, etc. So I think characters having wants is absolutely important, and I think that asking yourself as a writer the question, what does my character want, is also important, but I don't think that question should or need have a clear or simple answer.
Yeah, it occurs to me that most fiction functions because one or two characters are guilty of the sin of pride and saying, that applies to everybody else but not to me, and I'm going to test it out. And so you find their downfall comes from an excess of that virtue or vice. And that's how they get themselves in so much trouble and often bring down a lot of other people with them.
Yeah. I mean, without the struggle to understand what desire means, even if it's counterintuitive, even if it's a discovery of something that they didn't know that they were wanting, without that, there's no story, right? I mean, that's the drama of any story, is this sort of negotiation of how my desires bump up against the world. And of course, the question really is, how do they arrive at a truer judgment about themselves? I mean, I think of the Index of Self-Destructive Acts, and And it's a story of really a whole series of pretty decent characters. They're not villains or criminals. They're mostly upstanding citizens, and yet each in their own way, they make a choice to get something that they think is legitimate, that they want to help either themselves or somebody dear to them, and it often involves a kind of shortcut or a slight gray area that they step in. And often the result of that is, in a sense, a kind of almost tragic, in the sense that it sort of snowballs into something greater than you might say the original sin was, and that's fascinating to me.
Yeah, well, it's to me, it's precisely. I think one of the things we all want is, and this gets to Ron's point about pride. We all want to be able to tell stories about our lives in which we're the good guys. And I think what happens when you make a shortcut like that, and you are not willing to pay the consequences for that, and meaning in particular pay the emotional consequences. You're not willing to say, I did the wrong thing. And maybe I did the wrong thing because I'm not the person I should be, And so what you do is you tell a whole story that is the story you need to tell in order to justify the decision you made. And now you're in a particular narrative where you get to make a whole host of further decisions coming out of that. And the Index of Self-Destructive Acts is a pretty long novel, and one of the reasons for that is it has a number of different characters, and they're all given long stretch, basically equal time of being the point of view character. And that was a very conscious decision, because what I wanted was because we all experience ourselves as the main character, right? Nobody experiences themselves as the side character in someone else's novel. And so I wanted that for all of these characters, But, experiencing yourself as the main character to some extent means experiencing everyone else as the side characters. And there's something coercive about that, And we all know people, I think, if you don't know someone like this, you may be that person, who are incredibly compelling because they wrap you up in their story, and you want to be, for a little while, the side character in their story. They have that kind of charisma and that kind of energy, but at a certain point you realize that they only want you to be around to the extent that you will play that part in the story. And when you try and individuate yourself, when you try and make your own choices for your own reasons, then all of a sudden they're like, this is not for me, And so there's something very dangerous about our tendency to want to be the main character, And so what I wanted in the book was this, and I think it's one of the sources of our self-destructive acts, And so what I wanted in the book is to have each character get seen at certain stretches as the secondary character in someone else's plot, and then get seen as the main character. And each time that happens, you see how it radically reorients the story, and the story becomes about something else, and the same facts have an entirely different meaning. And it takes a lot of space to do that, but that's what I tried to do.
I certainly agree, Chris, with the earlier statement you made that it would be a mistake to write a book, a work of fiction in which the character seems destined to attain a single end. And yet, I guess what I'm curious about is, there is a kind of universal experience, I think, in fiction, the best fiction, in which, as the character struggles with desire, there is at least, I think, some commonality to the human story of coming to a place where you understand that I need more than I thought I needed. That in a sense that there's this sort of, literally this sort of realm of mystery, this kind of hunger for the infinite. That what I thought I wanted isn't enough. Do you feel that?
Yeah,
Ron?
I think that at least of a lot of the characters I've written about, I push them to the very edge, and then they go a little bit farther. A lot of people do this in their own lives. A lot of good qualities go into something they're doing, and they'll just push it a little farther. It's the Peter principle, basically, in fiction.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly of your fiction, Ron, that one of the ways that fiction can be realistic without being literally realistic is it pushes something to an extreme that makes us uncomfortable or seems out there, some Wild West scene or some, wild surge of guilty passion, to quote one of your novels. Right. And yet, by the very fact that it distances us from our immediate quotidian life, it actually I think, for example, The Sopranos, for example. I mean, the great thing about The Sopranos is that it's not about the mafia. It's about being kind of middle-class, white, suburban American, right? In the end.
Right.
Because those are the issues that leak out around the various hits and things that are going on, right? So the extremes can sometimes, I think that's where some of your genius as a writer is to find some of those really kind of crazy places, and they're thrilling to be in, but they do bring us back to normality at some point.
Yeah, I think one of the wonderful parts of Goodfellas is how Scorsese makes you want to be a mafia member for about the first hour, and then you see the tragedy that results of that. So that's what another kind of way that fiction works.
Yeah, and the Sopranos, I think which this returns to the very first point I made. Part of what it's about is what it means to inherit a tradition that is suffering its last gasps and that sort of thing. So you have these 90s era suburban New Jersey gangsters who have the Godfather poster on the wall, and they are romanticizing the life of this because they don't come in the heyday of this. They come in its sort of faded glory, and so they have to spend a lot of time theorizing about this thing of ours, as opposed to just living it, and they are the ones, there's various scenes where they go, they meet with the Italians come over and none of the second or third generation New Jersey Italians speak any Italian, and then they feel all sort of inauthentic about that and that sort of thing.
Yeah. I mean, wouldn't you say that one of the hopes that you might have for a reader of one of your stories is a sense that even if the story, in a sense, ends badly, that there's the human heart, there's a kind of infallibility to it, because in the end, even if it makes the wrong choices, it kind of recognizes that, and recognizing this need for something else, this sort of edge of mystery that they hunger for. And I think that can be true in both, it's clearly true in tragedy where you feel the sense of loss of what could have been, but it's even there, I think, in the best comedy, because, a comic story, while it ends happily, still reminds you of what, that the crisis that occurred in the middle of the comedy could have gotten the tragic. I think Shakespeare does this so beautifully, that even though there's the wedding and the dance at the end, there's always one character at the edge of that stage. So do you feel like, this question of the heart's infallibility, I mean, that really is our tether, in reading fiction, is connecting to that in some way.
Edgar Allan Poe said that if you could write a book that had the heart fully exposed, it would be a bestseller, because everybody wants to understand other people's hearts and their own feelings. Yeah. So
what about autofiction? What about this sort of contemporary trend that says, everything is constructed, our social world is constructed. We're also conscious of construction, that the best we can do is essentially blur the line between my life and my artistry as a fiction writer. I mean, it is, you may not practice it, but it's out there, and so would you mind for a while? I mean, we can condemn, but I mean, it certainly raises questions about where we're at and what the possibilities of fiction are, and where maybe we look for hope and avenues of openness beyond that. But I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
When you were first introducing these questions, you said there's a contemporary strain that says, the world is hard enough. Why do we have to make this stuff up? But I don't think that's what the critique is. I think it runs in exactly the opposite direction. It's not why would we make up these tragedies and put ourselves through this thing when there's enough real suffering, but it's instead, how can we afford this escapism? When we've got so many challenges that we face, So I think that that's part of what the impulse comes from, is this sense of responsibility towards the reality that we're in, and a sense that there's something frivolous about making stories up. There has always been a sense that there's something frivolous about making stories up, and there may well be, and I think for me, it's a necessary frivolity. There were, in my sort of writing lifetime, there are two occasions when novelists en masse started asking this "why are we writing" question, and one was after September 11th. And the other was in 2016, after the election. And in both cases, people said, we've got an emergency going on right now. The emergency stems in part from our failure to have understood certain things about the situation we're in. Post 9/11, there was this sense of like, oh, 1 billion people in this world hate us and our way of life, and we didn't even know they were there, and now we've got to learn about them, and for people in my milieu, which is fairly progressive sectors of New York, there was also after 2016 this sense of there's this whole segment of the country that we kind of didn't realize was there and disagreed with us about these things, and so there was this sense of almost anthropological need to go out and find out about these people. And in both cases, people started to think we can't afford to make stuff up right now. And my answer to that, how some people try and answer that is that the understanding you're looking for of the other, that's going to come precisely through fiction. Our best way to find out about all these people in the world, other than ourselves, is to try and engage in the imaginative sympathy of fiction. There is some truth to that, but I think about a talk that C.S. Lewis gave about life in wartime towards the end of World War II that was about whether they should close the humanities departments at Cambridge and Oxford essentially during the war, because they were sending all of the able-bodied men of university age, to go fight. And he did not make the case for, we need the humanities in order to understand the Nazi threat. He simply said, if we cannot afford to have these things during this emergency, then we can never afford to have them, because we are always in an emergency. Life is an emergency. And I feel that very strongly. I feel like, we have these moments, and one of them was in 2001. For many people, one of them was in 2016. For a great many of us, the last couple of years under COVID have been another, where we understand ourselves as being in an emergency, and then we say, we've got to throw all the rules out the window. Or we've got to give up on these certain things that in normal times are the things that make life worth living. And I just think we're always in an emergency. Life is the emergency, and we need, precisely in the moments where the emergency feels most acute and is most obvious to us, to hold on to the things that make life worth living. And for me, art creativity, and in particular the novel, are really among those central things.
On the subject of our theme, why do I have this yearning? Why do I have the yearning to read fiction when most people don't? Philip Roth once claimed only 200,000 people in the United States are interested in literary fiction, and there are 360 million of us. And of the people who are interested in reading books, it's a very small percentage. Most of the people outside on these streets are not looking for the next bookstore. And so it's not only the yearning to write fiction, but the yearning to read fiction that is kind of the heart of the question here. And I don't know where it comes from. I don't know why at one point in my life I decided I want to be a writer. And that was my secret ambition. I didn't even want to talk to anybody about it, but it was something that was the grounding for everything I did. And most people don't have that feeling, and I don't understand it. Where does it come from? There's nothing in my background, my nature really, that would explain why I wanted to become a fiction writer. It just seemed to come from out of the blue, and I'm sure it was that way for you.
Yeah, and I don't know that the country would be in better shape if that 200,000 or 2 million or 200 million. Perhaps not. I have to say it's not that important to me. I would love to have a huge audience. It's not because I believe that what I have to tell people is going to fix the world. But I know that I love fiction, I know that I love doing it, and I know that I love reading great books, and the fact that I love reading great books is enough for me to want to bring more of them into the world. I know that there are at least some other people out there who share that love, and that does feel like enough for me. I don't think, Roth was a huge, Portnoy's Complaints sold millions and millions of copies, So he went through periods of his life being on the bestseller list. And so then towards the end of his life, he was very pessimistic about the size of literary fiction because he wasn't selling 1 million copies anymore, And people of his generation who grew up in the shadow of Dos Passos and Hemingway and people like that, they were nostalgic for this time when writers could be the cultural figures that Hemingway was. And then the next generation were nostalgic for the time when writers could be the cultural figures that Mailer and Roth were. And I grew up with reading being a private thing, as you say. I did not feel like it connected me up to larger strains in the culture. I was well aware that very few of my peers spent a lot of time reading literary fiction. It wasn't. And so, and there weren't models who were huge cultural figures, and so that was never what it was about for me. And so it doesn't. I'd like to be able to make a living doing it, so I can keep doing it. But it's not particularly important to me to have fiction restored to some central place in the culture to the extent that it ever had one. I'd say this, I don't know how many people in front of us right now are serious readers of literary fiction, but if most of you are, a room this big full of this many people, that feels like a lot to me. That's a good feeling to have all of us together sharing this thing. And what's going on outside of this room, what's going on outside in the larger culture, is not a problem for me if we have this.
For all the talk about the way that e-books and smartphones and the nature of kind of the way we absorb media, it does seem that classic book reading persists. Like, the notion of the end of the book was a little premature. Do you find that you still get stories of people like wanting to sit down and open the first page of a book and like that?
Well, one of the things I noticed is that there are still people who don't want to know the ending of a book, and it never bothered me to know the ending of a book before I began it. But
you didn't skip to the end, though. You didn't like.
I didn't skip to the end, but some people are still riveted and captivated by books, and I think I'm just too distant from that because I'm looking at the mechanism, how things were done, and what can I steal here? But most people are not that way. They're still, they want to sink into the dream and not be abruptly waking from it.
All right, so second obligatory Flannery O'Connor quote. She says, "Writing a novel is a terrible experience during which the hair often falls out and the teeth decay." How difficult, I mean, is this one of these things where you hate it while you're doing it and then you're glad you did it, or do you love, is the process of writing a joyful one for you?
Well, I'm a joyful writer.
And you'll notice
I'm
Ron
like
has
Snoopy.
a lovely head of hair, which I do not.
I look for the occasion that there's always a sentence in a day of writing that I think is the perfect sentence. It may not be, but I think so. And so I run around like Snoopy saying, how do I do it, how do I do it? And I don't have misery about writing at all. One thing I have identified is that if I'm sad or miserable about writing, it's because I didn't need to write that scene. I need to look for something I'm really challenged by and enjoy.
I often get a great deal of pleasure out of writing. This is again the ambivalence. Sometimes it's hard, and I am the kind of writer where if I sort of stopped if I only did it when it was fun, I would not do it enough. And as with a lot of things in life, like exercise and things like that, it's actually you got to get through the resistance and the hard part to get to the part where it's fun, I think. On the other hand, if it were just the hard part, I wouldn't do it, And I mean, O'Connor was, I will never write work of the kind of power that she wrote, but I will say I am always a little suspicious of people who really go on and on about how hard writing is, And I mean, one of the things that is so moving about O'Connor as an example is that, she in the last years of her life, she knew she was dying at a very young age, and she spent those years writing, So and produced in that time much of her most extraordinary work, and so she was doing it under very trying circumstances, and perhaps the writing was what made things trying, but perhaps the writing was what made such trying circumstances livable for her. Otherwise, I think if she truly felt the way that she expressed in that quote, she wouldn't have done it. This was a woman who was quite literally on her deathbed as she was, and I think I am now in kind of early middle age, mid-career, at a point when I was younger, I saw peers who were kind of giving it up before they'd quite made it as writers. What I've now seen, which I'm sure Ron has seen plenty of, is peers of mine who did make it by the standards of what making it as a literary novelist looks like, who are giving it up. The thing is, if you are a wildly successful fiction writer, what happens is somebody approaches you and offers you a lot of money to write a TV show. So there's nothing about the culture that is going to push you to keep writing novels. even if you're successful at it. Then they want to take your abilities and monetize it in a different way. So the drive to write has to come from inside. And for me, it has to come from, on some level, enjoying the doing of it. You know, there's certainly some people who they feel a compulsion, they're miserable while they're doing it, and they keep doing it anyway. But I don't know anyone who truly feels that way who keeps writing. I think they just stop if it's really that hard all the time.
Well, to wrap up, I guess my question for you then, since you guys, God willing, are not giving up, is where do you go personally to find inspiration, to find stimulus, to write, to find hope in the value of what you do?
A lot of it's research, just reading biographies, and at one point, a person's life may grab you and say, I never knew that about him or her, and you want to explore that.
Well, you mentioned that my fiction is roughly set in the milieu in which I live, and I think that's in part because I'm drawing inspiration from just looking around me. It is part of how I just engage with the world, how I go about being a person in the world. You know, life presents questions to us, including questions, as I was saying before, that don't have clear answers, and that's, to me, when I feel urgently a kind of question and I don't feel an obvious answer to it, that I start trying to write about it.
Wonderful. Well, Ron, Chris, thank you so much for
Thank you.
a really
Greg.
wonderful, stimulating session. Let's thank our guests for being here with us today.
They're asking us to.
So immediately after this event, Chris and Ron will both be available to sign their books at the Human Adventure book table right outside the auditorium. And one last important announcement, your financial support makes it possible for us to keep the encounter free for others. So if you can, please give generously at our donation table outside the auditorium, or in a couple of clicks at newyorkencounter.org/donate. Your donation is tax deductible. Please join me in once again thanking our speakers.
Thank you to our panelists. Up next at 12:15, we have a presentation on diversity and dignity, a discussion on the meaning and relevance of diversity.